The train screeched to a halt under the gray morning sky of April 1945. Steam hissed from its rusted valves, and through the slits of wooden freight cars, dozens of weary eyes blinked into the light. German women, nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries from the Luftwaffe were herded out by armed guards. Their uniforms were torn, their faces pale from hunger and fear. The war was nearly over, but for them, the unknown had just begun. They were prisoners of the Americans, captured during the collapse of the Third Reich. Most expected harsh punishment, starvation, or worse. What they found instead would defy everything they had been told about the enemy. The camp stood on the outskirts of Reims, surrounded by barbed wire and wooden towers. Inside, rows of white tents shimmered under the rising sun. Trucks rumbled along the dirt lanes, carrying crates marked U.S. Army supplies. As the women marched in, their boots sinking into the muddy ground, they smelled something strange, sweet, warm, almost comforting. It wasn't gunpowder. It wasn't the stench of death that had followed them for years. It was vanilla. Somewhere beyond the wire, someone was making ice cream. The guards were young, many barely older than the prisoners. They wore clean uniforms, their rifles slung casually across their shoulders. The women braced themselves for humiliation. They'd heard stories, propaganda claiming that American soldiers treated prisoners with cruelty. Yet, when the gates closed behind them, the guards did not shout. They directed them calmly toward registration tables, where military clerks took names and ranks. A few offered smiles. One woman, barely 20, looked at the orderly piles of food behind the Americans, tins of Spam, bread, chocolate bars, and whispered, "They must be saving that for themselves." She was wrong. Later that afternoon, the women were lined up by a mess tent. The smell grew stronger, cold air mixed with the scent of sugar and cream. When the first prisoner was handed a small paper cup filled with white ice cream, she hesitated. It had been years since any of them had seen milk, let alone something so luxurious. She licked it cautiously, then froze in disbelief. It was real. Sweet, cold, and soft. Around her, others began to cry silently. In that moment, the world they thought they knew, the one divided between righteous Germans and barbaric allies, collapsed like a house of cards. The American camps were not palaces. They were military facilities built for efficiency, not comfort. Yet compared to the chaos of post-war Germany, they were islands of order. Prisoners were issued blankets, cots, and daily meals that followed strict nutritional charts. It was part of a policy driven from the top down, General Eisenhower's directive to treat all prisoners humanely, in accordance with the Geneva Convention. But for these women, raised under Nazi ideology that painted enemies as monsters, this humanity was incomprehensible. Many waited for the trick, for the cruelty that must surely follow such kindness. Days turned into weeks. The prisoners adapted to camp routines, roll calls, work shifts, and language classes. Some were assigned to kitchen duty, others to laundry or record keeping. Every evening, they gathered near the wire fence to watch the horizon glow with the fires of their collapsing homeland. One night, a jeep rolled into the camp carrying a steel canister packed in ice. The soldiers opened it carefully and began distributing bottles, dark glass, red labels, and the American symbol they had seen only in movies confiscated by censors. Coca-Cola. The first sip burned their throats with carbonation and sweetness. It tasted like nothing from the German world. No beer, no coffee substitute, no ersatz syrup could compare. For the women who had grown up during years of rationing and air raids, it was more than a drink, it was a revelation. The guards laughed, offering refills, explaining how the drink was bottled in factories across liberated Europe. Some of the women clutched the bottles as souvenirs, staring at the label as though holding proof that civilization still existed somewhere beyond the ruins. The Americans did not understand the depth of the prisoners' shock. To them, sharing ice cream or soda was simply part of daily life, mundane, even boring. But for those who had spent months fleeing advancing armies, surviving bombings, and scavenging for scraps, this small act carried immense symbolic weight. It meant mercy. It meant that the victors could have crushed them yet chose not to. In the hierarchy of war, mercy was more powerful than any weapon. Behind the barbed wire, strange friendships began to form. Some of the guards spoke a little German, enough to exchange jokes or stories about home. The prisoners, once indoctrinated to see Americans as soulless machines, began to realize their captors were human. One nurse recounted treating wounded soldiers on the Eastern Front. An American corporal listened quietly, offering her a cigarette. These conversations spread slowly, bridging two worlds separated by ideology and destruction. For the first time in years, the women could laugh without fear of being overheard by a political officer. News from outside filtered in through newspapers and radio broadcasts. Hitler was dead. The Reich had surrendered. Germany was no longer a nation but a scar divided by occupation zones. The women wondered what would become of them when they returned home. Some feared revenge from their own people, others dreamed of starting anew. Inside the camp, they began to taste a different kind of freedom, the freedom of thought, the freedom to question what they had believed. It was as if the sweetness of ice cream and the fizz of Coca-Cola had thawed something frozen deep within them. For the Americans, the camp was a logistical success story. Medical officers kept records, nutritionists monitored caloric intake, and engineers ensured a clean water supply. Yet beneath the orderliness lay an unspoken purpose: to show the defeated what America stood for. Not just power, but abundance. Not just victory, but decency. The women who had expected interrogation and punishment instead found themselves invited to movie screenings, listening to Glenn Miller on the camp loudspeakers. The enemy was not being humiliated. She was being re-educated through kindness. Still, doubts lingered. At night, some prisoners whispered that this generosity was temporary, that soon they'd be shipped to labor camps or trials. But the cruelty never came. Weeks passed, and the routines became predictable, almost peaceful. The guards changed shifts, the mess tent continued serving meals, and every Sunday, more ice cream appeared. When a new group of female POWs arrived, disheveled, terrified, expecting brutality, the older ones comforted them gently. "Don't be afraid," one said. "They give you ice cream here." By early summer, the camp had transformed into a surreal microcosm of post-war change. Former enemies laughed over sodas while their homelands smoldered. The world outside was collapsing into occupation and division, but inside the wire, an unlikely peace took root. The prisoners began to understand that the true power of the Americans wasn't just in their weapons or machines, it was in their ability to create normalcy out of chaos, to offer comfort amid defeat. Yet beneath this calm surface, one question lingered like smoke after battle: why? Why? Would the victors show such mercy to the defeated? What purpose did it serve? The answer would reveal not just a policy, but an entire strategy, one born not from the battlefield, but from the psychology of victory itself. The answer lay in a quiet office in Washington, long before the first German prisoner ever tasted Coca-Cola. In 1943, as Allied victory began to look inevitable, a small team of officers within the U.S. War Department had studied the aftermath of World War I. They remembered how the harsh treatment of prisoners and civilians had fueled German resentment, feeding the rise of Hitler. This time, the architects of American policy vowed to win differently, not only through firepower, but also through perception. The plan was simple: conquer the mind of the enemy before the ink of surrender had dried. They called it moral reconstruction. Instead of humiliation, they would use generosity as a weapon. Every loaf of bread, every medical treatment, and every bottle of Coca-Cola was part of a larger design, to show the defeated Germans what a different world could look like. The psychological warfare branch, led by officers trained in sociology and propaganda, saw this as a unique opportunity. If kindness could dismantle decades of indoctrination, then victory would last longer than any occupation. The women's camps became testing grounds for this philosophy. Behind the barbed wire, the seemingly innocent comforts were carefully chosen. Ice cream was not just a dessert, it was a symbol. During wartime rationing, even American civilians had limited access to sugar and milk, but the Army's quartermasters ensured supply lines to the camps remained generous. Engineers developed compact refrigeration units that could be loaded into transport trucks, powered by small gasoline engines. The technology was originally designed for field hospitals to preserve blood plasma and medicine. Now, it kept the ice cream cold for the prisoners. Every serving was a quiet demonstration of industrial might and logistical precision, a message that America could afford to be humane because it was powerful enough to be generous. Coca-Cola, too, was far from accidental. By 1945, the company had become an unofficial ambassador of American culture. Bottling plants followed the advancing armies through France, Belgium, and into Germany itself. Military engineers and civilian contractors built small-scale factories near depots, producing thousands of bottles a day for troops. When excess supply reached the camps, it was shared with prisoners. To the Germans, the drink represented abundance, the taste of an economy untouched by war. To the Americans, it was the taste of democracy, sweet, modern, and efficient. The women in the camps began to notice details that spoke volumes about their captors. The guards treated equipment with meticulous care, machines ran on time, and food was distributed with mathematical precision. Waste was minimal, order absolute. It contrasted sharply with their memories of ration cards, shortages, and fear-driven hierarchy. Even the smallest acts, repairing a broken cot, cleaning a water tank, reflected a cultural difference that the prisoners could not ignore. America's power, they realized, came not from cruelty, but from control. Meanwhile, across occupied Germany, the same policy echoed. Field reports from different camps told similar stories. POWs shocked by kindness, expecting punishment and finding order instead. Some of the women, once fervent believers in Nazi propaganda, began questioning everything. How could a people capable of building such abundance also show mercy? A few volunteered as translators or clerks for the Americans, hoping to learn their language. For them, understanding the conqueror became a path to survival, and perhaps, redemption. In one camp near Cherbourg, the experiment went even further. A unit of the U.S. Army Service Forces established a cultural recreation center for female prisoners. They screened American films, romances, comedies, musicals, to expose the women to life beyond the war. The reactions were visceral. Some cried when they saw scenes of families laughing in peacetime, of children eating freely, of women walking unafraid through clean streets. The contrast to bombed-out German cities was almost unbearable. Yet it worked. These prisoners began to spread the story: America, the land of plenty, the land that shared its ice cream even with its enemies. But there was another, more pragmatic reason for this approach: efficiency. American prison camps ran smoother when prisoners were calm, healthy, and cooperative. Uprisings were rare. Disease was minimal. The humane policy wasn't just moral, it was practical. Each camp was a self-contained ecosystem supported by supply chains that mirrored those feeding frontline divisions. Engineers from the Corps of Engineers designed standardized layouts for water, sanitation, and refrigeration. Civilian contractors produced prefabricated kitchens capable of feeding thousands. Every gallon of milk and sugar crate represented the industrial machinery of the United States working at its peak. The ice cream that melted in a prisoner's hand was cooled by the same energy that powered aircraft carriers and tank factories. Still, not all prisoners believed the kindness. Some assumed it was propaganda, a facade to win them over before interrogation. A few refused to eat, fearing poison. But over time, suspicion gave way to curiosity. They began to study their captors, their discipline, their humor, and their strange sense of equality between officers and enlisted men. German women who had grown up under a rigid social hierarchy found this particularly bewildering. In the mess line, a lieutenant and a private stood shoulder to shoulder. It was a democracy in miniature, playing out behind barbed wire. One story passed from camp to camp: a young Luftwaffe radio operator named Ingrid, captured near Kassel. When she arrived, she refused to speak, certain she'd be punished for serving the regime. Weeks later, she was seen chatting with an American sergeant over a shared bottle of Coke. She would later recall that moment as the first time she felt unafraid of the future. For the Americans, this transformation was precisely the point. The real battle wasn't for land, it was for belief. Outside the camps, the situation in Germany grew more desperate. Civilians scavenged in ruins, children begged for food, and entire cities vanished under Allied occupation. Against that backdrop, the stories of the POW camps spread like whispers of an alternate reality. Families of captured women received letters describing full meals and humane treatment. Some refused to believe it, assuming their daughters were forced to lie. But when repatriation began, returning prisoners confirmed the truth. They spoke of the ice cream, the cleanliness, and the strange kindness of men in green uniforms. The myth of the barbaric enemy dissolved. From a military standpoint, the policy achieved a subtle but profound effect. When occupation forces later took control of Germany, they faced less resistance. Civilians who had heard of the POW camps' conditions were more willing to cooperate. Trust, fragile but real, had been planted in the ruins. And at the center of that trust was a spoonful of ice cream, a sip of cola, and the realization that mercy could be more disarming than any weapon. By autumn, as camps began releasing prisoners back into civilian life, the results were undeniable. Many of the women left healthier than when they'd arrived. Some carried home not just their belongings but also their first taste of a new worldview. They had seen a nation that didn't need fear to command respect. They had tasted abundance, and it lingered long after they crossed back into a starving Germany. What began as a simple act of kindness had become an instrument of strategy. The Americans had discovered a weapon unlike any other, one that struck not the body, but the spirit. Yet as winter approached, and Europe settled uneasily into its new balance, another question began to emerge: could such mercy survive the politics of victory? Or would the same ice cream and Coca-Cola that softened prisoners' hearts soon be forgotten in the hardening lines of the Cold War? When the last prisoners left the camps, the fences stood empty under the same quiet skies that had once watched over them. The war was over, but something invisible lingered in the air, an aftertaste of mercy, an echo of humanity in the wreckage of total war. Across Europe, as nations counted their dead and rebuilt their cities, those who had passed through the American camps carried home a strange story. They spoke not of cruelty or punishment, but of comfort, food, and small luxuries that no one could have imagined during the final desperate months of the Reich. In a world hardened by suffering, such stories spread like fragile rumors of hope. The Allied command understood the power of these tales. They were not accidents of compassion but instruments of strategy. The same principles guiding the treatment of prisoners now shaped the rebuilding of Europe itself. As the Marshall Plan took form, American policymakers leaned on lessons learned behind barbed wire: feed first, rebuild second, and persuade through generosity. If mercy could change the hearts of captured enemies, perhaps it could stabilize entire nations. Factories that once produced military rations now manufactured food aid. Cargo ships that had carried soldiers across oceans now brought flour, milk powder, and medical supplies. The blueprint for Reconstruction had been drafted in the smallest of laboratories: prison camps where kindness had proven stronger than resentment. For the former German women POWs, life after captivity was a complicated awakening. Many returned to shattered cities where ruins stood like skeletons of lost pride. Some faced suspicion, even hostility, from neighbors who could not believe their accounts. "The Americans gave us ice cream," they said, and people laughed bitterly. Yet beneath the rubble, their memories stirred something new: curiosity, and a fragile admiration for the victors who had treated them with decency. These women became unexpected ambassadors, silent carriers of an idea: that America's strength was moral as much as material. Decades later, sociologists would trace early pro-American sentiment in post-war Germany partly to these returning prisoners, whose stories softened the edges of defeat. Psychologists in the U.S. Army took careful note of the results. They observed that prisoners treated with fairness and small luxuries adapted faster to post-war life, suffered fewer breakdowns, and showed lower resistance during debriefings. This knowledge flowed quietly into the architecture of future conflicts. In Korea, and later in Vietnam, American military planners recalled the German camps as examples of psychological control through benevolence. It became a doctrine of soft power before the term existed: win loyalty by granting dignity. The lesson was clear: mercy was not weakness, it was strategy. At a deeper level, something human had shifted. The same country that had unleashed the atomic bomb had also shared ice cream with its enemies. That paradox defined the New World. The brutality of industrial warfare had reached its peak, yet within that machinery, a spark of compassion had survived. The engineers who had built refrigeration units for the camps went on to design equipment for civilian hospitals. The logistics officers who once tracked milk shipments to POW camps later organized food relief for Europe. Their quiet efficiency, honed in wartime, became the foundation for humanitarian systems that fed millions. Out of the mechanisms of war came the machinery of peace. But memory, like war, is uneven. Not every prisoner experienced kindness. Some camps were harsh, especially during the chaotic final weeks of surrender. Yet the overall image endured: the taste of ice cream, the fizz of Coca-Cola, the clean beds, and the smiling guards. For the German women who had spent years surrounded by propaganda and deprivation, those small moments carried lifelong weight. One former Luftwaffe auxiliary would later write that she began to question the entire ideology of superiority after watching an American soldier mop a floor without shame. "They did not need fear to be disciplined," she wrote. "They did not need hate to be strong." Her words captured the heart of America's unspoken victory. As Europe divided into East and West, the memory of those camps took on new meaning. In the Soviet-occupied zone, returning prisoners who spoke well of the Americans were often interrogated, sometimes punished. The simple story of ice cream and Coca-Cola became a subversive tale, a whisper of a freer world beyond the Iron Curtain. In that sense, the psychological experiment extended far beyond its original design. It became part of the early Cold War narrative: America as a land not just of power, but of abundance and decency. Every memory of kindness became a quiet weapon in the ideological battle that followed. Inside the United States, the legacy also shaped a generation. Soldiers who had served as guards returned home with stories of unexpected gratitude from their former prisoners. Some wrote letters to the women they'd once overseen, exchanging Christmas greetings for years afterward. For them, the experience redefined the meaning of victory. It wasn't found in domination, but in restraint. They had learned that true control lay not in breaking the enemy, but in allowing them to see an alternative way of life. By the 1950s, Coca-Cola was no longer a wartime luxury, but a global symbol of American influence. Factories opened in West Germany, employing thousands. For many, the drink that had once shocked prisoners now flowed freely through the very cities that had been bombed. Ice cream parlors reappeared on corners where rubble once stood. The same sweetness that had once symbolized mercy became part of daily life. And in a quiet, almost poetic circle, some of the very women who had first tasted it behind barbed wire now served it to their own children, never forgetting the strange kindness of their captors. Historians would later debate whether the policy had been idealism or calculation. Was the ice cream a genuine act of humanity, or a carefully orchestrated psychological tool? Perhaps it was both. In the chaos of 1945, motives often blurred. Soldiers gave what they had, sometimes out of compassion, sometimes out of boredom, sometimes out of obedience. But regardless of intent, the result remained undeniable: an act of mercy that rippled through generations. It softened perceptions, rebuilt trust, and offered a glimpse of how victory could coexist with virtue. In the decades that followed, as Germany rose again and alliances shifted, the memory of those camps faded into history. Yet for the few survivors still alive, the details remained vivid: the glint of sunlight on a Coke bottle, the cold shock of ice cream on a starving tongue, the quiet realization that even in defeat, they were still human. It was not the kind of story recorded in official war diaries or after-action reports. It lived instead in personal recollections, in fragile letters, and in memories passed down like family myths. But it told a truth that statistics could not measure: that compassion, Even in war, leaves deeper marks than cruelty. The fences rusted away long ago, the guard towers were dismantled, and the grounds were reclaimed by grass. Yet if one were to walk those places today, the air still carries something intangible, a reminder that history's greatest victories are often measured not in territory or treaties, but in the moments when power chooses mercy. For the German women who tasted that mercy, defeat became the beginning of understanding. And for the Americans who extended it, compassion became the quiet proof of triumph. In the end, the war that devoured millions produced one of the strangest symbols of reconciliation, a scoop of ice cream, melting slowly under the European sun. It was simple, fleeting, and almost absurd against the scale of destruction. But in that fleeting sweetness lay a revelation that would outlast the war itself, an unspoken truth whispered through the barbed wire of history, that even the coldest hearts can thaw when offered the smallest taste of humanity.